I have engaged in lots of internet discussions about philosophy and religion over the years, and that's perhaps the biggest mistake of my life. One thing I've noticed in these discussions is that there's a certain type of interlocutor who just throws around names of fallacies at almost every opportunity. I offer some support for a claim from the fact that almost all relevant experts believe it, and I'm accused of the appeal to authority fallacy. I expressly define my terms at the outset, use the terms consistently in my argument, and yet I'm accused of equivocation. I offer independent support for a premise, and yet am accused of begging the question in asserting that the premise is true. And so on down the list. This interlocutor is guilty of what I call fallacy mongering, which is the misuse, abuse, and overuse of fallacies. Now, don't get me wrong, fallacies have their place in argumentation. But all too often, things that are actually good reasoning patterns are labeled fallacies, and likewise, fallacy accusations are often made far too liberally and incautiously. This is what should be avoided, and it's the topic of today's video. In particular, I'll be drawing from an earlier video I made on common internet mistakes in philosophy and religion. So, without further ado, let's dig in. Alright, mistake number 26, misusing, overemphasizing, and otherwise abusing fallacies. I like to call this one fallacy mongering, and it's very annoying. So let's get to pages 71 through 76 of Michael Huemer's Knowledge, Reality, and Value to see what is mistaken with this misuse, overemphasis, and otherwise abuse of fallacies. In other words, let's see what's wrong with fallacy mongering. So here's Michael Huemer helping explain what's wrong with fallacy mongering. So, Huemer writes, I've just produced a list of fallacies of the sort that you find in traditional critical thinking books and classes. So he gives a list of fallacies above. But I don't much like these lists, not even my own, and I have two reasons for disliking them. First, I think they misdirect attention. They direct attention to some problems that occur rarely while neglecting much more common errors. Not all traditional fallacies are rare, of course, but several of them are quite rare. I'm not even sure I've ever seen someone affirm the consequent or deny the antecedent. To the extent that the list identifies genuine errors, most of them are pretty dumb, so you probably don't need much discussion of them. For some more common and useful to discuss errors, see section 4.3 below, and by the way, we're going to be getting to that section in just a minute in our video here. Second, I think the fallacy lists lure people into thinking that some perfectly good inferences are wrong, because these perfectly good inferences sound like what the fallacy definitions are talking about. I refer to this as the fallacy, which is the fallacy of rejecting a good inference because it has been superficially labeled as a fallacy. Let me explain with some examples. Ad hominem. Students who learn about the ad hominem fallacy are liable to draw the lesson that one should never reject an idea or argument because of who says it. But, in fact, negative information about an individual is often very relevant to whether you should believe what they say. For example, say you see a television ad for quote-unquote clean coal. The ad contains some evidence and arguments for the claim that your country should rely on more clean coal for its energy needs. Now suppose you find out that this ad was produced by a coal company that would stand to profit if people accept the ad's message. The particular company in question is an especially immoral one that has been in trouble with the law on several occasions for safety and environmental violations. Now, how should you treat this information? Ignore it because the bad traits of the company are irrelevant to the truth of its message? That might be what you would think after reading about the ad hominem fallacy in your critical thinking book. But of course, that would be wrong. The bias and the immoral qualities of the company make it very likely that the ad is going to be misleading or outright wrong. If the ad makers are any good at their job, you, without extensive expertise in the area, probably wouldn't be able to identify exactly how it is misleading. Therefore, you should apply a heavy skepticism to the ad and all of its content. In this case, you would be rejecting ideas and arguments because of the immorality of the party putting them forward. This sounds like exactly what people are calling the ad hominem fallacy, but it's not fallacious, it's smart. What about ad populum? Well, this is the quote-unquote fallacy of believing something because most people believe it. But what exactly is supposed to be wrong with that? Well, here are three interpretations. First, maybe the idea is that most people believing P is irrelevant to whether P is true. That is, if most people believe it, that doesn't mean it is more likely to be correct. The problem is that this is obviously wrong. If most people believe something, that obviously does make it more likely to be correct than if most people don't believe it. If most of our beliefs weren't true, the human species would die out pretty much immediately. Sometimes people elaborate on this quote-unquote fallacy by citing examples of beliefs that were once widely held but were false, for example that the sun orbits the earth. So let me now just mention a few typical examples of beliefs that are widely held. Dogs exist. It is generally lighter in the daytime than at night. The sky is blue, not red, green, or yellow. There are more than 3 human beings in existence. Human beings commonly have beliefs and desires. Putting your hand in a fire hertz. 6 is more than 2. The Earth has existed for more than 5 minutes. When you drop rocks near the surface of the Earth, they generally fall. No objects are completely red and simultaneously completely green, etc. Once you get the hang of it, I'm sure you can extend that list for quite a long time. Now, which would you say there are more of? Widely held beliefs that are true, or widely held beliefs that are false? If you don't think most of those items are true, there's something seriously wrong. Second, maybe the idea is that most people believing P does not conclusively prove that P is true. Well, that's true, of course, but it's also a frivolous point to make. Of course it isn't conclusive proof. So what? Who was expecting conclusive proof? You may as well complain that it hasn't been conclusively proved that the Earth orbits the Sun. And of course that's true, right? It's merely overwhelmingly likely that the Earth orbits the Sun in light of our evidence. And thence conclude that modern astronomy rests on a quote-unquote fallacy. Third, maybe the idea is simply that people often put too much weight on popular opinion. The fact that many people believe P is indeed evidence for P, but it is not as probative as people think. This is indeed very plausible in many cases. It's easy to overgeneralize this point, though, so bear in mind that people don't always overestimate the reliability of popular opinion. What about appeals to authority? Well, students who read about the appeal to authority fallacy may conclude that one should never believe something because of who says it, but often one should. Especially if the person who says P is very smart and reasonable, then P is likely to be true. This doesn't guarantee that P is true, of course, but it often makes it likely. Begging the question. The concept of begging the question is often misused by philosophers. The misuse comes about something like this. The philosopher starts with the idea that an argument begs the question, and therefore is fallacious, when someone who rejects the conclusion wouldn't, or shouldn't, or couldn't reasonably be expected to accept all the premises. That italicized phrase is treated as something like a definition of the fallacy. The philosopher then looks at some particular deductive argument. He notices that if you start by assuming the conclusion of the argument is false, you can deduce that one of the premises is false. Usually the philosopher identifies a specific premise that is least obvious and says that if the argument's conclusion is false, then that specific premise is false. He concludes that someone who rejected the argument's conclusion would also reject that premise. Therefore, to assert that premise is to beg the question. People who fall for this mistake fail to notice that it represents a rejection of all valid deductive reasoning. In a valid deductive argument, by definition, if all the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That is logically equivalent to the following. If the conclusion is false, then one of the premises must be false. So if you start by assuming the conclusion is false, and the argument was valid, you can always deduce that at least one of the premises is false. For example, take the argument, Miley Cyrus is a person, all people are mortal, therefore Miley Cyrus is mortal. This could be said to beg the question, because if you don't think Miley Cyrus is mortal, then you should not accept the premise that all people are mortal. Given the obvious fact that Miley is a person, to assert that all people are mortal just quote-unquote assumes that Miley is mortal. In other words, it just assumes the very conclusion that you're trying to demonstrate, or so one might claim. Now, presumably it's false that all valid arguments are fallacious, so something went wrong there. The problem is the definition of begging the question. Here's a bad definition. You beg the question when someone who rejected your conclusion would reject one of your premises. Here's a better definition. You beg the question when the justification of one of your premises depends upon the justification of the conclusion. In the Miley inference mentioned above, it's true that someone who insists that Miley is immortal would presumably also deny that all people are mortal, but it's false that the justification for the claim that all people are mortal must depend upon the justification for the claim that Miley is mortal. Rather, the justification for the claim that all people are mortal could be had by, say, an inductive inference. Like, so far, literally every single person who has ever lived has died within 125 years of their birth. So the justification for thinking that premise is true does not require antecedently assuming that the conclusion is true, or antecedently assuming that the conclusion is justified, etc. Next up is post hoc. When A is followed by B, that is evidence that A causes B, provided that you don't know anything to the contrary. Of course, it's not conclusive evidence, and in most cases you need more information to form a justified belief. But talk of the post hoc quote-unquote fallacy is facile and unhelpful. It tempts students to think either, 1, that the fact that A is followed by B is evidentially irrelevant to the causal claim, which is just wrong, or 2, that an inference is only good if the premise conclusively proves the conclusion, which is also wrong. A related slogan is correlation doesn't imply causation. The saying means that just because A and B go together regularly does not mean that one causes the other. Granted, if there is a reliable correlation between A and B, that does not guarantee that there is a causal connection. It could just be a coincidence. But if the correlation is well established, it becomes vanishingly improbable that it's just a coincidence. There will likely be some causal explanation. Maybe A causes B, or B causes A, or some third factor C causes both A and B. But there are some errors that humans are prone to that you really do need to be aware of, beginning on page 77. Anecdotal evidence. So often people try to support generalizations by citing a single case or a few cases that support the generalization. And scientists call this anecdotal evidence. For example, you try to show that immigrants are dangerous by citing a few examples of immigrants who committed crimes. Now, anecdotal evidence has two problems. First, usually, when people do this, they don't pick a case randomly. They search for a case that supports their conclusion while ignoring cases that don't. Second, random variation. Even if you pick the cases randomly, it can easily happen just by chance that you picked a few atypical cases. In the immigration example, what you should actually do is look up the statistics on crime rates for immigrants compared with native-born citizens. And also you should control for other factors when you do that, because sometimes immigrants are going to be finding themselves in low socioeconomic status neighborhoods and so on, and those sorts of things can also affect crime. And so it may not be immigrants specifically that's responsible for it, but socioeconomic status, etc. So anyway, you need to be very careful with statistics. As is said, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. Base rate neglect, shout out here to my Bayes theorem video. I talk about this in depth and why, like, probabilistically it's a mistake, and I go through the underlying reasons for why it's a mistake and how to try to combat it. But in short, a base rate is the frequency with which some type of phenomenon happens in general. For example, the base rate of heart disease is the percentage of people in the general population who have heart disease. The base rate for war is the percentage of the time that a country is at war, etc. When you want to know whether some kind of event is going to happen or has happened, the best place to start is with the base rate. If you want to know whether you have a certain disease, first find out how common the disease is in general. If 1% of the population has it, then a good initial estimate is that you have a 1% chance of having it. From there, you should adjust that estimate up or down according to any special risk factors or low risk factors that you have. Most people don't do this. People commonly ignore base rates. For example, suppose there's a rare disease that afflicts 1 in a million people. There's a test for the disease that's 90% accurate. Suppose you took the test and you tested positive. In other words, the test says you have the disease. Question: given all this information, what is the probability that you have the disease? Now, many people think it's 90%, and even doctors will sometimes get this wrong, which is, of course, disturbing. But the correct answer is about 0.0009%, which is less than 1 in 100,000. And here's the explanation. Say there are 300 million people in the country. Of these, 300, that is 1 millionth, have the disease, and 299,999,700 don't. The test is 90% accurate. So 270 of the 300 people who have the disease are going to be testing positive, right? That's 90% of the 300. But also, 29,999,970 of the 299,999,700 who don't have the disease would also test positive, right? That's the 10% of the false positive rate. If it's a 90% accurate test, well, then 10% of the test results are going to be inaccurate. So among the basically 300 million people who don't have the disease, about 10% of them are still going to test positive for having the disease, and that's going to be close to about 30 million. So, out of all the people who test positive, right, out of the 30 million people who test positive who don't actually have it, and the 270 people who tested positive who do have it, right, the proportion who actually have the disease among those who tested positive is 270 divided by 270 plus basically 30 million. And that's only 0.000009, or about 0.0009%. So, in short, do not neglect base rates. Yes, the dreaded confirmation bias. When asked to evaluate a theory, people have a systematic tendency to look for evidence supporting the theory and not to look for evidence against it. And this happens especially for theories that we already believe, but it can also happen for theories we initially have no opinion about. For example, if asked whether liberal politicians are more corrupt than conservative politicians, a conservative would search through their memory for any cases of a liberal doing something corrupt, and they would not search through their memory for cases of conservatives being corrupt. A liberal, on the other hand, would do the reverse. Each just looks for cases that support their pre-existing belief and doesn't look for evidence against it, and that's called confirmation bias. Selectively searching out evidence in favor of your beliefs while ignoring or downplaying evidence against them. To combat this, it's necessary to make a conscious effort to think of exceptions to the generalizations that you accept, and to look for evidence against your existing beliefs. Whenever you feel inclined to cite some examples supporting belief A, stop and ask yourself whether you can also think of similar examples supporting the negation of A or the falsity of A. Dogmatism and overconfidence. So people who study rationality have a notion called calibration. Your beliefs are said to be well calibrated when your level of confidence matches the probability of your being correct. For example, from all the beliefs that you hold with 90% confidence, about 90% of them should be true. When you're 100% confident of things, they should be true 100% of the time, etc. Now, most people are quite badly calibrated. In fact, almost everyone errs in a particular direction. Almost everyone's beliefs are far too confident. People say they are 100% certain of a bunch of things, but then it turns out that only, say, 85% of those things are actually true, and there are psychological studies of this. This is the problem of overconfidence. Almost everyone has it, and almost no one has the opposite problem, underconfidence. So you should assume that you're probably overconfident in your beliefs. You should therefore try to reduce your confidence in your beliefs, particularly about controversial things, and particularly for speculative or subjective claims. For the vast majority of individuals who hold positions and opinions on philosophical topics, there are going to be many, many more people who have studied the subject longer than them, who know more of the literature than them, who know of objections to their positions that the people are unaware of, who perhaps are more intelligent than them, and so on, and yet who disagree with them. Quite plausibly, that should at least lower your confidence to some extent in your positions. No one's saying here that you have to become a radical skeptic in light of all this, but it would seem kind of bizarre to recognize that there are people who have studied this subject far longer than you, many of whom are more intelligent than you, many of whom are aware of objections and arguments of which you aren't aware bearing on the question, and who disagree with you. To be utterly unmoved by that seems a bit dogmatic and overconfident. Another problem is oversimplification. People so often oversimplify philosophical issues. Say you're thinking about the morality of abortion. A tempting simplification would be to say that there are just two positions, pro-choice and pro-life, or pro and anti-abortion. Either fetuses are people and killing them is murder, or fetuses aren't people and killing them is perfectly fine. But this overlooks the possibility that late-term fetuses are people, but early-term fetuses are not. Or maybe personhood comes in degrees, and fetuses become progressively more person-like as they develop. Or maybe fetuses are persons in some senses, but non-persons in other senses. And maybe some of those senses may be morally relevant, maybe some are more morally relevant than others. Or maybe they are persons and have a right to life, but perhaps right to life does not imply right to use of another person's body, etc. There are a range of possible positions on this topic, not just two, and people tend to way oversimplify these topics. I'm not saying that any of these positions here is correct. My sole point is just that there are a number of conceptual possibilities within the conceptual landscape with respect to abortion, as well as lots of other philosophical topics. And people far too often oversimplify them. They get in a kind of dichotomous mindset where there's either position A or B, neglecting that there are countless other positions. Oh yes, treatment effects versus selection effects. This one's big that I'd like to go through. Let's say that you've created a new educational program for preschool children. You want to know whether it improves learning. What you would do is look at kids after they've had your program and compare them to the kids of the same age who didn't have your program and see if the first group performed better on tests. Let's say the kids who had your special program performed 10% better on later tests on average. Then you'd probably conclude that your program works. But wait, here's another possibility. Suppose, as would usually be the case, that the kids who entered your special education program were the kids whose parents chose to enroll them in that program. The rest were kids whose parents did not decide to enroll them. Furthermore, maybe the parents who enroll their kids in special programs are on average smarter and value education more, and perhaps have a higher socioeconomic status, etc., than the parents who don't do that. Furthermore, maybe intelligence and value placed on learning are partly genetic, and moreover, maybe these parents' socioeconomic status and various other environmental factors are influencing it, and so these parents pass those traits on to their kids, and the environment that these kids are growing up in affects them as well. So the children who went into your program were already on average smarter and more interested in learning than the children who didn't go into the program. And maybe that explains why they did 10% better on the tests after the program. Maybe your program has no effect at all. It's just that you got the smart kids in it, and that made the program look good. That is an example of a selection effect, a case where it looks like A causes B, but it's actually just that the instances of A that you tested were already more likely to be Bs for other reasons. Selection effects are contrasted with treatment effects, cases where the thing you're testing really does cause the effect that it's thought to cause. In the education example, academic success is correlated with taking the special program. This could be due to a treatment effect, right? Meaning that the program causes kids to learn more. Or it could be due to a selection effect, right? Meaning the program selects students who are already good at learning. Selection effects are very often mistaken for treatment effects. I'm going to give my own example of this in a second, but let's go through humors. Say you want to know if some vitamin improves people's health. So you look at people who take supplements of that vitamin regularly, and you find that they are healthier than the people who don't take it. You think this shows that the vitamin supplements are good for people. But actually, it's more likely a selection effect. People who take vitamins are more likely to also be exercising, eating healthy foods, paying attention to their diet, and so on. Which is why they would be healthier on average, even if the vitamins did absolutely nothing for them. But here's another example that comes up sometimes on Twitter and just internet spheres more generally. Quite often I've seen apologists appeal to the preponderance of theists within the field of philosophy of religion as somehow indicative of the epistemic merits of theism vis-a-vis atheism. Right, so if you go to the 2020 Phil Papers survey, the vast majority of philosophers are atheists. But when you look at specifically philosophers specializing in philosophy of religion, the numbers flip. The vast majority of philosophers of religion are theists. Some apologists are wanting to say, oh, hey, look, the people who are best situated on the topic, the philosophers of religion, are theists. So that's indicative of the epistemic merits of theism, or maybe this is powerful evidence for theism and so on. But very plausibly, this is best explained by a selection effect. Those who are theists are more likely to go into philosophy of religion and study religion and their theistic beliefs in the first place. They're just going to be far more interested in it. It's going to be something that's part of their daily life, etc. And there's also some empirical reasons to think that selection effects are responsible for this. And in general, I mean, to those apologists who are appealing to theists dominating philosophy of religion as strongly indicative of the epistemic merits of theism, I mean, to me, that's about as silly as saying that, well, hey, Islam must be true, and the epistemic merits of Islam are very strongly indicated by the fact that those who actually specialize in Islamic philosophy, those best positioned to evaluate the merits of Islam and the reasons for Islam, almost all of them are Muslims, which is true, by the way. I mean, let's just take a step back. And I use this example because it's going to be helping the Christian apologists who make use of this point about theists dominating philosophy of religion. I wonder why those who specialize in Islamic philosophy are almost all Muslims. Let's think for just a second. Maybe it's because among those philosophically inclined, Muslims are far more likely to go in and actually specialize in Islamic philosophy than non-Muslims. The best explanation for the preponderance of Muslims within those who specialize on Islamic philosophy is this selection effect. They're just far more likely to do that in the first place. And quite plausibly, the same thing is going to be happening with the Phil Paper survey. Very plausibly, the dominance of theists within philosophy of religion is explained by a selection effect. Theists are just far more likely to be specializing in philosophy of religion. Anyway, for all this fallacy mongering stuff, I highly recommend Emerson Green's video, Why I Don't Care About Logical Fallacies, as well as the full podcast episode from which this little extract was taken. So in short, whenever you see someone say, that's a fallacy, that's a fallacy, that's a fallacy, have them spell out what exactly is fallacious about it, and whether the point can be put in another way which doesn't succumb to the relevant fallacy. And just beware of all these fallacy websites. They usually far oversimplify fallacies, like they'll far oversimplify begging the question. Begging the question is actually a very difficult and vexed philosophical topic in itself. There's lots of philosophical work on it. So just be very careful and recognize nuance. This all goes to the oversimplification point.